Can you give us the political and narrative context to this story today? Well, yesterday, and the FT, of course, reporting that Reeves isn't going to pursue this income tax rise. Mm-hmm. What's happened? How have we got here?
So, Ollie, I'm going to take you back to before the election.
Way back when,
a happier time for the Labour Party in many ways. When they were riding...
unburdened by responsibility.
When they were riding high in the polls, but planning for a general election. I understand that Labour officials went to Rachel Reeves while they were coming up with the manifesto, and they said, look, I think we're really at risk of boxing ourselves in for government if we rule out increasing taxes on working people. And my understanding is that she replied, that would be a nice problem to have. Because I think you have to really understand about the Labour Party is that they're very used to losing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they have sort of snatched defeat from the jaws of victory many times before. You know, Labour's tax bombshell, they have been really bitten by this. There is a public perception that Labour will increase your taxes, and they wanted to make sure they had economic credibility. They couldn't be hit on that by the Tories. So they went into the election campaign wanting to make sure that tax increases were nowhere near them, even though really all the experts were saying that whether it was the Tories or Labour, tax increases were inevitable. So we go into the election campaign, and Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were basically drawn into a game of tax whack-a-mole, where the Tories, one by one, would keep saying, well, you're going to increase capital gains tax, are you going to increase income tax? You know, are you going to unfreeze tax thresholds? And they didn't want to keep ruling things out for government, but they ended up sort of backed into a corner where they had to sort of define that promise of, you know, not increasing taxes on working people. And the way they defined it was by the taxes. And they said that they wouldn't increase the main forms of taxation, which raise, I think, about 75% of the tax income in the UK. Mm-hmm. So income tax, national insurance and VAT. They said they wouldn't increase any of those. Fast forward, Labour wins the election. They have the last budget, they increase national insurance, but on employers rather than employees, a fudge that was really unpopular with business. But I think for normal working people, they actually kind of landed it that it wasn't a tax increase on them. But we've had a year where Rachel Reeves has left herself quite a small buffer. We've basically had a year of speculation about how she will have to increase taxes because, you know, there are calls from the Tories to cut spending further, and they think that they could squeeze the welfare budget more in the Labour side, but pretty much they think they've squeezed it as far as they can. It just has to be tax increases. So we've had a whole year building up to this, and in recent weeks, Rachel Reeves has been laying the ground for a really difficult decision to break that promise, to just go for it, raise income tax because it's the right thing to do, the inevitable thing to do. And they were probably going to do it in a way that they would argue broke the letter of it, but not the spirit of it for reasons that we might come on to. And then today, we have the FT story. Last night, the FT breaks this story that actually they're not going to do that anymore. I'm sure we'll come on to why in a bit more detail, but partly it looks like they've bottled it over the difficult politics because we saw what happened with the Lib Dems when they broke their pledge not to increase student tuition fees. I think that, you know, David Cameron never broke a manifesto promise, as far as I'm aware. You know, it was his thing, you can't break a manifesto promise, it's just too politically difficult. There have been so many nerves in the Labour Party about doing this, but they've been laying the groundwork for it. Now, after a kind of tumultuous week with all this West Streeting, Number 10, briefing drama, and maybe actually some better forecasts, they've just decided they're going to do something different. And it looks like they're going to raise lots of little taxes on special interest groups instead and do some other things. But it means that they have basically been rolling the pitch for a completely different policy, for something completely different that's not going to happen. There's a whole hypothetical budget that they were preparing for that's no longer happening.
Very well explained, it has to be said. There's a lot of history there. A year ago, we were told it's a once-in-a-generation tax-raising budget. Reeves said that herself. And then as we neared the political certainty, the economic certainty that we could all see, Reeves gives this speech, which is relatively extraordinary, I would say, for a chancellor to sort of give a set-piece speech only weeks out from a budget. And she says, the fiscal rules stand. We need to increase headroom. We're not going to cut spending. We're not going to borrow more. Ipso facto, taxes are going to have to increase. And I interpreted that speech as a speech to the markets than necessarily a speech to the electorate. That was a way of rolling the pitch and saying, this is coming, get ready for it. But it's not really coming, is it, Will? Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yo. I don't know. Does Rachel Reeves know? Who knows?
Does she know? It seems messy. It seems so confused.
It is. It's, I think she is clearly looking at approaching this via stealth tax rather than by actual blunt tax. But I mean, as to like the question of like whether or not she's going to raise income tax, like yes, definitely. I mean, she did last time. Okay, so that increase on employers' national insurance was a tax on working people because the OBR report that came out immediately after that budget said about 3/4 of this will be paid through lower hiring, lower wages, fewer promotions for employers. So they kind of already have broken that manifesto promise. And by doing more stealth tax, so by potentially the most likely way to do it, and when you talk to people, economists, about like the easiest way to raise tens of billions more from the public, it generally is, like freeze the thresholds at which people start paying certain levels of tax. So you get about 12.5 grand of money that you're not taxed on your income, and then you start paying 20%, and then at 50 grand you've got another threshold, and then at 100, and then at 125. So as inflation increases, the price of everything else goes up, and as people get pay rises, more and more people get dragged into the higher tax brackets. Fiscal drag, famously the least fun kind of drag, and then
I can think of funny ones.
I've used that joke twice in columns, and I did not apologise for using it again. And
if it works, it works, man.
And so I think what clearly they're looking at is doing more of that, extending the thresholds freeze for longer, which Jeremy Hunt already did. So in his last autumn budget, he extended the threshold freeze to an extent that then the OBR said this is equivalent to raising income tax by 4 points. So, there's like quite a significant raise on income tax. It's just you can say that it's not, but that's exactly what it is. It's just you're using, relative values rather than nominal values in a way. So freezing them is one thing, but also what's talked about in this FT report from last night is lowering the thresholds, which would be a really incredible way for Labour to target some of its remaining voters by saying to, kind of like younger people probably who live in cities and have quite good jobs, hey, look, now you are faced with the kind of marginal tax rate that your boss was previously paying. Is like, I mean, what a way to like laser target your kind of metropolitan core voters.
And that's definitely something that Labour insiders are saying today, that even if it's not the sort of the basic rate threshold that they touch, I think that Labour will probably still try to stick to the spirit of that manifesto, trying to protect low earners, trying to show that they're not really hitting them. It's people with the broadest shoulders. Still, like even with the higher rate, they, I think Labour people say those are actually our voters. They're not the voters we want to have, but they're the voters we have. And so even though the Labour Party often acts like its voter coalition is different, it is the type of people that Will describes, the people in cities with good jobs. And so I think there are nerves in the Labour Party about something like that. But it's fair to say that on the thresholds, it's a bit less clear what will happen, and we probably need to wait until the budget. What is quite clear that the Treasury is not steering away from is that income tax increase is probably no longer happening.
Yeah, I interviewed Torsten Bell when he was director of the Resolution Foundation. It would have been before the election, so let's say maybe 2 years ago. And he was talking about fiscal drag as this incredibly pernicious, unpleasant, damaging economic thing. Now, as we understand it, he's got quite a significant role in writing this budget, and one wonders what his perspective is, perhaps not just on freezing the thresholds, but maybe even lowering them, and whether he still adheres to that previous type of thinking. It's really interesting to talk about kind of the aspirational middle class and the idea that you know, for a generation of people in Britain who don't want for necessarily, you know, sports cars and ultra wealth. All they want is a nice bottle of wine on the weekend when they have their dinner, you know, maybe a European holiday. And that at the end of the day, if your living standards are decreasing year on year, if you don't drive the Audi anymore, you have a Skoda, or like whatever it is, there's this real sense of kind of declinism. And this can be quite a politically toxic thing, right? And I just, it makes me think about the politics of all of this. I was talking to a Tory MP this morning, low tax Tory MP, although that's a truism, I guess, to describe a Tory as a low, but this person is a low tax Tory. And so I said, oh, have you seen the FT? You know, we're talking about that income tax rate rise is not coming. They weren't like, oh, yippee, great. The first thing they said was, God, this must be the most trailed budget I can remember. And they've already U-turned on something that we don't even actually know if it's actually going to happen or not. The first remark was not brilliant. Taxes are not going to increase. The first remark was, this is a dumpster fire. And I thought that was really striking.
Well, I think, yeah, a few things to say on that. I think it's that really extraordinary mixture of a very well-trailed budget and then a last-minute massive U-turn on basically the main measure in it. I mean, I think Labour insiders are sort of saying that this is partly because of the politics and them pulling off this idea that they want to take a big risk and just cleanly break a manifesto pledge. But I think part of it is also they would say they don't need to raise quite as much. You know, wages have been higher, which means they're getting a bit more from taxes. There are other actually kind of good things happening in the economy. They've been kind of trying to be all doom and gloom, so people will be a little bit pleasantly surprised. And so they got the final forecasts and they actually realised that maybe they could avoid doing it. But still, it's basically, as far as I can tell, and everyone who's been messaging me today can tell, it is pretty much completely unprecedented for a budget to so substantially change on the last day, because the way it works, you sort of do your draft budget and you send it over to the OBR, and then they come back and then they say, okay, we've got our final forecasts. Here's how much extra money you might have for the final tweaks. It's either extra money or less money. And then they do the final revisions and then you're locked in. And they were locked in from Wednesday when they decided it. So basically on the last day, they have actually decided we're not going to do this. And now, even though, you know, there's been a little bit of like panic in the markets, a little bit of a gilt sell-off, like not massive, but still like, you know, I'm sure you can talk a bit more to that, Will, but sort of, even though it hasn't landed amazingly, they're locked into it now. And we won't know the finer details, but it's, yeah, while the fallout hasn't been amazing, it's sort of not looking good. But I think on the wider politics of it, it's sort of, you know, the Labour Party was really braced for this to be a really unpopular budget. You know, there were just so many questions around the politics of breaking a manifesto pledge. Is that worth doing? If it's like clean, you can raise a lot of money. Maybe you get a war chest in time for the next election. It gives you more money to improve public services, but you've broken a promise and you've damaged trust. There's been so much chat about the risk of that. Now they've decided not to do it. I think there's a sort of different question of, you know, picking your poison. You know, I've just, you know, outlined the sort of the pros and cons of that approach. Now we're looking at a kind of different budget where it's more stealth increases, like Will has described, and probably a lot of kind of narrow tax increases on special interest groups, which didn't go brilliantly for Labour last time. You know, like with the farmers, you know, it actually, rather than making an argument that everyone will chip in, especially those with the broadest shoulders, when you go for specific interest groups, you know, if they do a gambling tax, banking tax, more things on capital gains tax, maybe a lot of people will be up for that, but it means that you annoy very specific big lobbying groups, and those that you do tax are going to pay a lot more. So they've kind of, you know, pulled away from one risk, but they've opened up a whole other set of challenges.
I saw in George Eaton's morning call this morning a senior Labour source saying this is all pain, no gain, that we've rolled the pitch to such an extent, we've expended the political capital to get us to this point, but now we're not actually going to get the tax receipts.
Yeah, and the whole point of rolling the pitch like that is to like pacify the markets and not be Liz Truss again. And then you get to, you know, you get right to the very last point, as Ailbhe described, of, you know, this process of rolling the pitch. And then you go, actually, do you know what? We'll do something else. So accordingly, the markets go, oh, I don't know.
But I think that was also to prepare voters and Labour MPs. Like, they did not want to surprise anyone. Like, get ready for this to be a difficult budget. We're going to break a promise, warn the voters about why we need to, get Labour MPs on board. It was for those three interest groups, really. But they're not doing that anymore.
Like raising the basic rate of income tax. So I totally get that would have been like breaking not only a manifesto promise, but a massive taboo. Like, that hasn't changed for 50 years. So it is embedded in the public mind that is just kind of what income tax is on work in this country. But on the other hand, if you are taxing in a way that like basic income tax raises are the least damaging to economic growth. So if you are also doing a budget where you're trying to unleash growth to the extent that any chancellor can, you do need to think about that. And that's the other thing about doing lots of little nibbly taxes on different sectors is you not only, as Ailbhe said, you not only incentivize people to go and create media campaigns and go on marches and do loads of lobbying, and so you not only create loads of new stories about each new interest group that you're damaging, but you also you incentivize those people to make different investment decisions, or sort of take things abroad, or not do things that they were previously going to do. So the blunter the tax, as a very general rule, the blunter the tax, the less impact it has on economic growth, which is quite contrary to the way that they're sort of the whole rest of the way they talk about the economy, and that being the whole deal. It's going to save us from having to do more tax rises in future.
And it's worth thinking about the income tax increase that is no longer happening, what that would really have looked like. Because as well as all the arguments that Will is making about that being cleaner and sort of less damaging to growth, the way that we gather they were going to do that wasn't just a straight penny on income tax or something. The plan was to increase income tax by 2p and decrease national insurance by 2p. And so actually, a lot of people would have said that's still, income tax has gone up. That's an open and shut case of breaking your manifesto. But they would have had an argument to make. Whether they would have been able to pull it off is a different question. But they would have been able to make an argument that this was an important reform of the tax system, that they would have been able to say to you and I, you're not paying a penny more on your wages than you were before. We've just sort of broadened the tax base by making this on income tax rather than national insurance. So the people who are paying more are landlords, people who get income from their shares, from other investments. It's working pensioners or very wealthy pensioners. We have actually protected working people. We've stuck to the spirit of the manifesto, even though we haven't stuck to the letter of it. And so that, it's been a criticism of the tax system for quite a long time. Lots of different people say that we overtax income and not wealth. That would have been a bit of a switcheroo that would have allowed them to do that. I mean, someone messaged me this morning saying, this is so sad. They were about to do a hard thing and pull it off. And they're not going to do that anymore. It's almost as though it's only now that they're not doing it that people are making the case for why it might have been okay. It would have been really tricky politics, obviously, because they're doing it from a position of basically unparalleled unpopularity.
Yes.
Keir Starmer, basically the least popular prime minister since polling began. Obviously, it would have been tricky. But frankly, from my conversations with Labour MPs, most of them weren't going to vote against it. I don't think there would have been a rebellion substantial enough to bring down the government. I'm sure your Rachel Maskells or whatever might have been tempted to rebel. Most wouldn't, because there's a kind of feeling like you can't vote against a budget. It's a sort of confidence vote. It's the main thing the government does, along with a king's speech or a queen's speech. So Labour MPs might not have been happy. But I think if the government has pulled back from this thinking that they are averting a rebellion from Labour MPs, they've misread it. Labour MPs would have voted for this, and they have sort of, yes, it would have broken a manifesto pledge, but they've lost the opportunity to do something quite clean and probably that's better economically.
So on this, right, as you say, I saw a YouGov poll recently that actually placed Prince Andrew as 1 point more popular than Keir Starmer, just to give a sense of sort of this. I know the scale of the rot, right? And so you look at that. You look at, if you were looking at the New Statesman a couple of months ago, you might have seen a cover story where a certain journalist wrote "Just raise tax" on the cover.
I remember that one. Yeah.
It was Will. Shock, dear listener. It was Will Dunn. There's I would say on the left there is a increasingly consensus position. I've seen Bastani talking about this a lot recently. Someone who's more traditionally on the sort of the left fringes of these ideas. Taxes need to change. You could simplify the tax code. You could increase taxes. Now, if you are in that position of unpopularity, possibly insurmountable unpopularity, there might be a strain of argument that goes, it's over for us. We're not going, as in we, me, Keir Starmer, you, Rachel Reeves, and possibly Morgan McSweeney, we cannot recover from this. But what we can do is do something that the country needs.
Yeah, take one for the team, guys.
Exactly. And when May comes around and the pasting that we're anticipating we're going to get, we've done our bit, we're going to step aside and we're going to give Wes Streeting, Andy Burnham, irresponsible Andy Burnham when he was shifting bond markets by giving New Statesman interviews, right? Someone else can have a crack at this. Yeah. Do you find that argument compelling?
I think, on the national insurance thing, so first of all, I think that that would have given them a good way to respond to that by saying, we're just changing we're getting your landlords to pay more tax.
I thought it was a good policy.
But also, the Tories would not have really been able to criticise them for that because Jeremy Hunt was talking about getting rid of national insurance entirely. And obviously the only way he would have paid for that would have been to say, okay, we take 8 points off national insurance, you get 5 points back on income tax. And that would have been very fair and it would have been a good thing and it would have been a tax cut for working people and a tax increase for landlords and wealthy pensioners. So, and in the piece that you so kindly referred to, the cover story by me, it was what was really struck me was the number of people from across the political spectrum. So some of the people I spoke to from that were there were people from the Adam Smith Institute who were saying broadly similar things. And actually there was a report that was a collaboration between, a whole bunch of people that were like think tanks from across the political spectrum last week that made similar points saying the tax system just has to be reformed. It's inefficient and somebody has to rip that plaster off. Yeah. And I think it's probably... from a position of abject unpopularity, how much worse could it get? Let's find out.
Let us find out. Can I just closing remarks really from both of you? Can I just invite comments in relation to how unique the government's position is on this? How much of what's happening is a product of the lack of fiscal headroom that's available to Rachel Reeves, the both in terms of the sort of the complaints about potential leadership challenges and the results that has on the bond markets? Is it a problem of their own making? Are there extraneous factors here? Maybe I'll come to you first, Ailbhe.
It's a bit of both in that Rachel Reeves just unquestionably inherited a really, really, really difficult situation with basically spending cuts penciled in by the last government that would have been undeliverable. And you had places like the IFS saying that. So they were... Labour people say that the Tories had a sort of scorched earth policy, that they were sort of storing up problems for them. Mm-hmm. They talk about sort of arriving in their departments and money being spent twice, and needing to find that extra money. So pretty difficult where those spending cuts weren't going to be manageable. They would have to increase taxes. The UK's debt is very high, and because interest rates are pretty high, they're spending a lot on just paying debt interest, which is, just like spending public money on nothing, on interest. Rachel Reeves talks about that all the time as a massive waste. So I think, to be fair to Rachel Reeves, the inheritance is bad. You can't sort of dismiss that when she says it. But they have been really bad at boxing themselves in with loads of promises that are really undeliverable. Going back to that election, but since, why did Rachel Reeves need to say this is a once-in-a-generation budget? We're raising taxes just the once when she's coming back for more. It's been not just pre-election, but they've kind of continued to do it. And I think Labour people, there are lots of criticisms of the economic strategy, but, deciding to unfreeze thresholds, for example, which could have raised some money, the Tories wouldn't really have been able to criticise them for that because they froze thresholds themselves. Things like that, pretty criticised.
If they refreeze them now, I mean, that's just bad hygiene.
Food standards issue.
Yeah, it's a recipe for gastroenteritis.
You can't be refreezing things.
Once with the Tupperware. That's it.
But
Will, is that election pledge? Is that the original sin?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, like as Ailbhe revealed, sort of Reeves saying like that would be a nice problem to have. I'm guessing Reeves and Starmer would now agree it's not a nice problem to have. And there are all these kind of like structural factors in markets and in like who buys our debt and how our debt is arranged that are just continuing to make it harder and harder for them to borrow, more expensive to borrow. They are in a really difficult position. And the Tories made the most of that. You had that weird advert with the kind of like red piggy bank thing like floating around in the sky. Do you remember that attack?
Yeah.
You had, Jeremy Hunt sort of talking about Labour's tax rises as he was imposing tax rises during like the time that Labour would be in power. And you had, I think it's not a great situation for them to be in. Like it has been incredibly difficult. But yeah, they're not making it easy on themselves either.